The pilot fell unconscious at 30,000 feet. 300 passengers started to panic. The co-pilot begged for help over the speaker. Then a quiet teenage girl with headphones stood up. Nobody knew she had a secret, a military father and flight training that would save everyone on board. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The voice that came through the speakers made every person on Flight 447 freeze in their seats. This is First Officer Daniel Carter speaking from the cockpit. I need everyone to stay calm while I ask something unusual. Is there anyone on this plane who has pilot training or knows how to fly? Captain Rodriguez just collapsed and I need help up here right now. 315 passengers sat in shocked silence. No one expects their pilot to fall unconscious at 30,000 feet. No one expects to be asked if they can help fly a Boeing 737 across the mountains between Los Angeles and Denver. The cabin had been peaceful just minutes before. People were reading, watching movies, sleeping. Babies cried softly. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon flight, the kind where nothing interesting happens. Now everyone sat frozen with fear. Some people started crying. Others grabbed their phones to text their families. A few started praying quietly. The flight attendants looked worried as they tried to calm passengers down, but their own hands were shaking. In seat 19C, a 17-year-old girl with brown hair and a ponytail slowly took off her headphones. Her name was Maya Chin, but nobody on this flight knew that. She traveled with papers that just said unaccompanied minor, because of reasons she couldn't explain to strangers. For the past 2 hours, Maya had looked like every other teenager on the plane. She sat with her phone and headphones, ignoring everyone around her. The businessman in 19B had glanced at her once, seen she wanted to be left alone, and hadn't tried to talk to her. The older woman in 19A had smiled kindly but respected the teenage signal of, "Don't talk to me." The flight attendants had checked on her 3 times. They used that special voice adults use with teenagers they think need watching. They asked if she needed snacks, if she knew where the bathroom was, treating her like she might not understand how to sit on a plane. Maya had smiled politely each time and gone back to her phone, making them think she was just texting friends or scrolling social media like any normal kid. This was exactly what Maya wanted. Drawing attention would lead to questions she couldn't answer. Her presence on this flight was already complicated without people getting curious about why a 17-year-old was flying alone. But Maya Chin wasn't ordinary, though she'd spent 17 years learning to look that way. Her father had taught her that the best operators are the ones nobody notices until they need to be noticed. Her father was Commander Robert Hawk Chin, United States Navy, one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the military. His call sign Hawk was famous among pilots for reasons that were still classified. He'd flown missions that saved lives and changed outcomes in ways the public would never know about. Among military aviators, that call sign meant instant respect. Maya had grown up on naval bases, moving from one to another, living where neighbors were other military families who understood that fathers sometimes disappeared for months on secret deployments. She'd gone to schools on bases where kids learned early that you don't ask where parents went or what they did. She'd spent her childhood around aircraft carriers and flight decks and hangars, soaking up knowledge that most teenagers never see. She'd watched her father and his squadron prepare for missions with discipline that became as familiar to her as breathing. Her father had trained her because he believed knowledge could save her life. He'd taught her to read flight instruments when she was 11, explaining navigation and control systems during evenings when he was home. He'd used training manuals and simulator programs to show her how pilots think during emergencies. He'd taken her to air shows, let her sit in cockpits, introduced her to other pilots who shared their knowledge because they understood that Commander Chen's daughter wasn't just curious, she was a serious student of aviation. By age 15, Maya could read instrument panels that looked like random dials and screens to most adults. She could understand radio talk between pilots and air traffic control. She could explain emergency procedures and backup systems that regular passengers never think about. She'd studied her father's flight manuals with his permission because he trusted her and wanted her educated beyond what regular schools taught about physics and engineering and making decisions under pressure. She'd learned not just the technical parts of flying but the mental side too. How pilots are trained to stay calm and follow procedures even when their plane is falling and every instinct says to panic. This knowledge wasn't something she advertised. Teenagers who understand military aircraft systems don't fit into normal social groups. Maya had learned that being visibly different made life harder at regular schools where other kids cared about sports and dating instead of flight envelopes and emergency procedures. She had friends on various bases who understood her background because they shared it, kids of military pilots and special operations who grew up with knowledge that set them apart. But in public, on commercial flights, in civilian spaces, she became invisible by choice. Just another teenager with headphones who wanted to be left alone. The announcement from First Officer Carter changed everything. Maya sat very still for maybe 10 seconds while her mind processed the situation with training that kicked in automatically. Her father had drilled into her that emergencies show who people really are. That crisis strips away comfortable pretenses and reveals whether someone can act or whether they'll freeze. She could hear adults around her starting to panic. Voices rising. Someone crying. Someone demanding answers. The businessman beside her gripped his armrests, breathing fast and shallow. Nobody was moving toward the cockpit because regular passengers don't volunteer to fly planes. The flight attendants were trying to keep order while clearly struggling with their own fear. Their faces showed they understood how serious this was. Their training hadn't prepared them for the pilot collapsing at cruising altitude with no backup plan except hoping someone aboard could help. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her movement was so calm and steady that the businessman beside her didn't notice at first. She stepped into the aisle and walked toward the front of the plane, moving with purpose. The flight attendant near first class saw her coming and immediately moved to stop her. Her expression mixed concern and confusion. Why was a teenage girl leaving her seat during an emergency? "Sweetie, you need to go back to your seat and buckle up," the flight attendant said. Her voice was strained but still trying to sound professional, though her hands shook. "We have an emergency, and all passengers must stay seated until we know what's happening." "I heard the announcement," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying none of the panic filling the cabin. The co-pilot asked if anyone has aviation experience. "I need to speak with him right now because I can help, and every second we waste talking is a second we don't have." The flight attendant looked at her with disbelief. This was obviously a 17-year-old girl. A minor. Someone who shouldn't be approaching the cockpit during normal times, and definitely not during a critical emergency when the captain was down. "I appreciate that you want to help," the flight attendant said with the patience adults use when dealing with kids who don't understand serious situations. "But this is a very serious emergency that needs professional expertise. I need you to return to your seat right now before I have to get someone to escort you back." "My name is Maya Chin," Maya said, her voice still calm but with an edge that made the flight attendant pause. "My father is Commander Robert Chin, call sign Hawk, United States Navy. I have extensive aviation training that your co-pilot desperately needs right now. I understand you're following protocols, but I'm asking you to break them and let me into that cockpit before this gets worse, because I promise you I know what I'm doing and I can help First Officer Carter stabilize this flight." The flight attendant stared at her. Teenagers don't talk like this. Teenagers don't claim to have expertise that could help with professional pilot emergencies. Other passengers nearby were watching now, their fear momentarily distracted by this strange confrontation. Someone behind them muttered about kids watching too many movies. Someone else said this wasn't the time for games. Everyone assumed this girl was either delusional or seeking attention or somehow not understanding reality. But the flight attendant had been trained to recognize genuine authority in unexpected places. Something in Maya's eyes and voice triggered instincts that said this wasn't a teenager playing pretend. The military terminology, the specific mention of a call sign and rank, the way she spoke without hysteria but with simple directness, these details added up to something that seemed impossible but couldn't be immediately dismissed. "Wait here," the flight attendant said, making a split-second decision that violated her training but matched her gut feeling that this situation was so far outside normal that normal rules might not apply. She moved quickly to the cockpit door, knocked in a specific pattern, spoke through the intercom urgently. Moments later, the reinforced door opened slightly to show First Officer Carter's face, pale with stress, his eyes showing the strain of trying to fly the plane and handle a medical emergency alone while knowing hundreds of lives depended on his decisions. The flight attendant spoke rapidly to Carter, explaining that a teenage passenger was claiming aviation expertise and military connections. Maya could see the co-pilot's expression shift through several reactions in seconds. Skepticism, desperation, calculation, and finally a grim willingness to consider anything that might help because their situation was bad and he had no good options. He looked past the flight attendant directly at Maya, studying her with the quick assessment pilots learn when evaluating whether someone can be trusted. "What's your father's call sign?" Carter asked, his voice rough with stress but sharp with focus. "Hawk," Maya replied immediately. "Commander Robert Chin, VFA 41 Black Aces Squadron, previously stationed at Naval Air Station Lemoore, currently assigned to operations I can't discuss in open spaces." His squadron commander is Captain Lisa Martinez, call sign Viper. His wingman is Lieutenant Commander James Park, call sign Dragon. I can provide more verification if you need it, but I'm asking you to let me in that cockpit now because you need help and I have training that can make a difference. Carter's expression changed completely. Those weren't details a teenager would know unless she genuinely had access to military aviation circles where call signs and squadron assignments were common knowledge. The name Hawk carried weight among pilots who followed military aviation. While Carter had never met Commander Chin personally, he'd heard stories about missions that made that call sign recognizable to anyone who paid attention to fighter pilot communities. "Get in here," Carter said, pulling the door fully open and gesturing for Maya to enter quickly. "I don't know how much you actually know, but Captain Rodriguez had what looks like a massive stroke about 5 minutes ago, and I've got this aircraft on autopilot while trying to coordinate with air traffic control and figure out emergency landing options. I could use an extra set of hands and eyes, even if you're just reading checklists or helping me watch instruments while I focus on flying." Maya stepped into the cockpit and immediately processed the scene with training that let her see past the emotional chaos to the technical reality. Captain Rodriguez was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his breathing rough and irregular, clearly having a severe medical emergency that needed immediate hospital care that was impossible at 30,000 feet above mountains. The instrument panel showed the aircraft was stable in level flight under autopilot. But Maya knew autopilot couldn't handle the complex decisions required for emergencies. Couldn't talk to air traffic control. Couldn't manage the dozens of critical tasks pilots handle continuously during normal operations and especially during crisis. First Officer Carter looked exhausted and overwhelmed. Sweat showed on his forehead despite the cool cockpit temperature. His movements showed the strain of trying to do 2 jobs at once while dealing with the shock of watching his captain collapse without warning. He was young for a first officer, probably early 30s, competent enough to earn his position but clearly not experienced enough to handle this with the calm that comes from decades of flying through every possible emergency. "What do you need me to do?" Maya asked, her voice cutting through the chaos with clarity that made Carter focus completely on her. "I need to get Captain Rodriguez out of his seat so I can secure him and make sure he won't interfere with controls if he has a seizure," Carter said rapidly, speaking faster than normal as stress compressed his words. "Then I need to coordinate with Denver Center about emergency landing options because we're over the Rockies and we need an airport that can handle a 737 with full emergency response. I need to calculate fuel and descent profiles and brief the cabin crew about emergency procedures. And I need to do all this while flying because autopilot can only do so much and I can't make mistakes with 300 people depending on me." "Okay," Maya said, already moving toward Captain Rodriguez with confidence that came from growing up around military pilots who trained constantly for emergencies. "I'll help you move Captain Rodriguez. Then I'll take the right seat and assist with communications and checklists while you focus on flying and making command decisions. I know Boeing systems and I can read instruments and I understand emergency protocols. Tell me what you need and I'll do it exactly as you direct." Carter stared at her for a moment, clearly struggling to process that a 17-year-old was speaking with competence that matched experienced crew members. But desperation overrode skepticism and he nodded sharply. Together they carefully moved Captain Rodriguez from his seat, a difficult task in the confined cockpit that required coordination and strength Maya had developed through years of military fitness training her father insisted was essential for handling physical emergencies. They secured Rodriguez where he couldn't accidentally touch any controls. Maya could see his condition was grave, his breathing shallow, his color poor, signs he needed intensive medical care far beyond what could be provided in an aircraft cockpit. Maya slid into the right seat, the captain's seat. The instrument panel surrounded her with information she processed automatically through years of study. Airspeed, altitude, heading, engine parameters, fuel quantity, navigation displays, weather radar. Dozens of systems all reporting their status through digital displays and analog gauges that told the complete story of the aircraft's condition. Everything showed normal operations except for the most critical system, the human pilots, where one was unconscious and the other was barely holding together under impossible stress. Carter returned to the left seat and immediately grabbed the radio microphone, his hand shaking slightly. "Denver Center, United 447, we have an urgent situation. Captain incapacitated, appears to be a stroke. Currently unconscious. First officer at controls with assistance from passenger with aviation training. We need immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport with full emergency response, and we need to start descent as soon as possible." The reply came immediately, the controller's voice professionally calm but with concern underneath. "United 447, Denver Center copies your emergency. Understand pilot incapacitation, requesting immediate diversion. Stand by while we coordinate. Current position shows you about 130 miles west of Denver International. Can you maintain present altitude and heading while we work vectors? Affirmative, maintaining flight level 300 and present heading, Carter replied, his training overriding stress to deliver clear communication, though his hands gripped the yoke with tension visible through his shoulders. We have fuel for extended holding if necessary, but I'd prefer to begin descent and approach as soon as possible because our crew situation isn't stable. Maya was already pulling up navigation displays and calculating descent profiles, her fingers moving across screens with familiarity from hundreds of hours in simulators her father had given her access to through military connections. She understood how to read instrument approach procedures and calculate descent rates and determine optimal paths that would bring a heavy aircraft down safely without creating passenger discomfort or structural stress. She pulled up weather for Denver International, noting wind conditions and visibility and runway configurations, processing data that would be essential for planning their approach. Denver International current conditions: winds 260 at 15 knots, visibility 10 miles, ceiling scattered at 3,000 feet. Maya said clearly, reading from displays showing real-time weather data. Runways 34 left and 34 right active for arrivals. Both are 12,000 feet with full ILS approaches available. We should request 34 left. It has better emergency vehicle access and can keep us clear of other traffic. Carter looked at her sharply, surprised by her proper terminology and apparent understanding of airport operations. How do you know all this? He asked, momentarily distracted by the impossibility of a teenager speaking like an experienced crew member. My father taught me, Maya said simply. He believed knowledge might save my life someday, and he spent 17 years making sure I understood how complex systems work and how to think clearly during emergencies. I'm not a licensed pilot and I'm not claiming I can fly this plane, but I can assist you with procedures and calculations and communications so you can focus on the actual flying and decision-making. The radio crackled again. United 447, coordination complete for your emergency diversion. You're cleared to descend and maintain flight level 240. Proceed direct to Denver VOR. Expect vectors for ILS approach runway 34 left. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Medical facilities alerted for priority ambulance on landing. Souls on board and fuel remaining? Carter keyed the mic, United 447 descending to flight level 240, direct Denver VOR. We have 315 souls on board including crew. Fuel remaining approximately 18,000 pounds. We'll require immediate medical transport for incapacitated crew member who had apparent stroke about 12 minutes ago. Maya was already working through descent checklists, calling out items from memory her father had made her memorize. Descent checklist. Pressurization set for descent, passenger signs on, cabin crew notified, altimeters cross-checked and set for destination elevation, landing data computed, approach briefing to complete prior to final. Carter glanced at her again, and this time his expression showed recognition that whoever this teenager was, she had genuine training proving invaluable during a crisis where every small task he could delegate freed his mental capacity for critical tasks only he could perform as the remaining qualified pilot. He began the descent, carefully managing throttles and controls to bring the massive aircraft down smoothly while monitoring multiple systems and preparing mentally for the approach and landing that would require absolute precision with no margin for error. Behind them in the main cabin, passengers were experiencing their own crisis of fear. The announcement about pilot incapacitation had created exactly the panic airline crews trained to prevent. Flight attendants moved through aisles trying to provide reassurance while secretly sharing the passengers' terror. Some passengers prayed. Some cried. Some called loved ones, leaving messages that sounded like final goodbyes because they assumed this flight would crash. The businessman from seat 19B was telling others that the teenage girl from his row had gone to the cockpit, and this information spread through the cabin like wildfire, creating new waves of confusion as people tried to understand why a child would be in the cockpit during an emergency. In the cockpit, Maya and Carter were working through the complex choreography of emergency descent procedures, their coordination improving with each passing minute as Carter recognized Maya genuinely understood what she was doing and could be trusted with tasks that would normally require a qualified crew member. She handled radio communications while he flew. She monitored instruments while he calculated approach parameters. She pulled up procedures and checklists while he made decisions about speeds and configurations. They fell into a rhythm that resembled the crew resource management airlines trained their pilots to practice, where workload is distributed according to capability. United 447, Denver Center, descend and maintain 12,000, reduce speed to 210 knots, turn left heading 080, vector for downwind to runway 34 left. Descending to 12,000, reducing to 210 knots, turning left to 080, Maya replied, handling radio communication with practiced precision while Carter focused on executing the instructions with careful attention to airspeed and altitude. The descent continued through multiple altitude assignments as Denver Center guided them lower and positioned them for approach, vectoring them through airspace being cleared of other traffic to give the emergency aircraft priority. Other flights were held or redirected to create a protected corridor for United 447. Emergency vehicles on the ground were taking positions along runway 34 left. At 10,000 feet, Carter began final approach preparation, configuring the aircraft for landing by extending flaps and gear, carefully managing the additional drag and changes in handling. Maya called out each step of the landing checklist, verifying all systems responded normally and they were on track for a stable approach. The aircraft responded smoothly to Carter's control inputs. The autopilot now disengaged as he hand-flew the final approach with concentration that blocked out everything except guiding 315 people safely to the ground. United 447, you're cleared. ILS approach runway 34 left. Contact Denver Tower on 119.3. Tower, United 447 is with you on the ILS 34 left. We have the field in sight, requesting priority landing clearance. Maya transmitted, switching frequencies smoothly. United 447 Denver Tower, you're cleared to land runway 34 left. Winds 270 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment standing by. No other traffic is a factor. You have the airport to yourself. Carter brought the aircraft down through the final approach segment, his hands steady on the controls now despite the stress of the past 40 minutes. His training and experience allowed him to execute the landing with smooth precision even though exhaustion and emotional strain pulled at the edges of his consciousness. Maya watched instruments and called out altitudes and speeds, providing backup monitoring that helped ensure Carter maintained the exact flight path required for safe landing. The runway appeared ahead through the windscreen. Emergency vehicles lined up along its length with lights flashing, creating a corridor of red and white that looked like a strange welcoming ceremony for an aircraft that had just survived a crisis that should have ended in disaster. The main landing gear touched down smoothly, the impact barely noticeable as Carter executed a textbook landing. He deployed thrust reversers and applied brakes with careful modulation, bringing the massive aircraft to a controlled stop while emergency vehicles rolled alongside. United 447 is down and stopped on runway 34 left. We need immediate medical transport for our incapacitated crew member, Maya transmitted. Copy that, United 447. Medical units approaching your position now. Remain on runway and await emergency personnel. Outstanding work bringing that aircraft down safely, both of you. Carter finally released the controls and sat back, his hands trembling now that the crisis was over and the adrenaline that had kept him focused was draining away. He looked at Maya with an expression mixing gratitude and disbelief and something close to awe. Who the hell are you? Carter asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was barely containing. I mean, I know you're Commander Chen's daughter, but that doesn't explain how a 17-year-old kid knows how to handle emergency procedures like an experienced crew member. I grew up around military aviation, Maya said simply, removing the headset that looked oversized on her teenage frame. My father believed being unprepared was the most dangerous condition someone could live with. So he taught me everything he could about flying and systems and emergency procedures. I never expected to need it like this, but I'm glad I had it when you needed help. The cockpit door opened. Flight attendants rushed in with paramedics who immediately began assessing Captain Rodriguez and preparing to transport him to the waiting ambulance. Other emergency personnel began boarding to assist with passenger evacuation and check for any other medical issues. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing footage that would appear on every broadcast within the hour. Airport officials and FAA investigators arrived within minutes, beginning the documentation process that follows every aviation emergency. When they learned a 17-year-old passenger had been in the cockpit assisting the first officer, their skepticism was immediate and obvious. Regulations don't permit unauthorized personnel in the cockpit. But when they checked Maya's identification and ran background verification revealing her connection to Commander Robert Hawk Chin, attitudes shifted dramatically. That call sign opened doors and commanded respect throughout military and civilian aviation communities. Phone calls were made to military liaison offices, which confirmed Maya Chen was indeed the daughter of one of the most decorated fighter pilots in recent military history. That she'd grown up with access to aviation training and resources far exceeding normal civilian education. That her father's reputation vouched for her competence in ways official certifications couldn't match. The story exploded across news media within hours. The combination of dramatic emergency landing and teenage hero created exactly the narrative that captures public attention and generates millions of views and shares. Video from news helicopters showed the aircraft landing smoothly despite the crisis. Interviews with passengers revealed collective shock when they learned the quiet teenage girl with headphones had actually saved their lives. The businessman from 19B gave emotional interviews describing how he'd sat next to Maya for 2 hours assuming she was just another teenager on her phone, never imagining she possessed expertise that would prove critical. Flight attendants who'd initially tried to send her back to her seat talked about their disbelief when this 17-year-old insisted she could help, and their amazement when she genuinely saved the flight. Passengers who'd been certain they would die expressed gratitude that their lives had been saved by someone young enough to be their daughter or granddaughter. Aviation experts interviewed by news networks initially expressed skepticism that a teenager could meaningfully contribute to handling a commercial aircraft emergency. But First Officer Daniel Carter gave detailed accounts of exactly how Maya had handled communications and checklists and system monitoring with competence that freed him to focus on flying, emphasizing that without her assistance, he would have been overwhelmed and potentially unable to manage all the simultaneous demands. Other pilots who learned the full details acknowledged Maya had performed at a level equivalent to a qualified crew member and that her training had made a crucial difference in the outcome. The military aviation community responded with pride because Maya's actions reflected the training and values Commander Chen had instilled in his daughter, demonstrating that children raised in military families absorbed capabilities civilians rarely encounter. Commander Robert Hawk Chen arrived at Denver International within 8 hours, traveling from his classified assignment through military transport that moved with the priority reserved for emergency family situations. When he reached his daughter in the private lounge where airport officials had taken her away from the media chaos, he pulled her into a long embrace that communicated pride and relief and love beyond what words could express. He had trained her for exactly this kind of situation without ever wanting her to face it. Had given her knowledge that most fathers keep from their children because it represents dangers they hope their kids will never encounter. "You did good, kiddo," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You did real good." Maya just held on to her father and let herself finally feel the weight of what had happened. For 40 minutes in that cockpit, she'd been calm and focused and precise. Now, in her father's arms, she could finally be 17 again. The story of Maya Chen became one of those rare aviation incidents that captures the public imagination, not because of tragedy, but because of the unexpected heroism of a teenager who looked ordinary but carried extraordinary knowledge. It became a reminder that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who can save everyone when everything falls apart.